Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Festival of Debate event. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, whatever time of day it is, to join us. So, my name is Johnny, and I work for the not-for-profit, worker-owned social enterprise called Opus Independence that is behind the Festival of Debates. The festival programme this year started on the 16th of April and runs all the way through to the 25th of May. It has included 65 events, over 150 speakers, and working with 50 different partners. The festival aims to explore the entangled ecological, economic, and political crises we collectively face. There are no easy answers, but we hope the festival gives the space to explore and hold complexity and uncertainty and brings together a community of people to make change where they are. Most of our events, as you will be aware, are free at the point of access. We keep ticket prices as low as we can. If you are in a position to be able to donate to support the festival, if you go to thefestivaldebate.com, you can share any amounts that you can help in supporting the festival. We want to tell new kinds of stories at the festival this year about the societal challenges and big opportunities for positive change we're seeing through these events. So you will get an email at the end of this. Please do and help us shape the festival for coming years. It's not just a kind of like tracking numbers exercise. It's very much your inputs shape the festival, inform what themes we will use next year and the following years to come. As you will no doubt be aware, this is an online event. So, housekeeping, if you hear a fire alarm, you should definitely go and check it. It's your house, and therefore you could be in imminent danger. So, we're going to run for about a total of 90 minutes conversation after Eri sharing some of his ideas with Simon. And then there will be the opportunity for Q&A. But that'll be the format we're running non-stop. So if you need to grab a drink at any point or anything else, please feel free to do so. We are recording, as I say, so you will have the ability to catch up. If there is an issue with anyone on the recording front, just direct message myself and we can make sure that you don't appear in any videos that get put up online. But without too much of a further ado, you will hopefully be reasonably aware of why you are here this evening, and that is to launch Eri's, or celebrate the launch of Eri's new book, Human Flourishing. Eri is a senior lecturer in education at Bath University. He has a breadth of local and national experience working within the third sector and student union movements, in particular researching and campaigning for social equality and disability rights. He's a trained advisor and coach and has almost 10 years experience conducting social policy research in areas such as well-being, mental health, higher education policy and practice, and social welfare. He is going to be guided along the way through chapters of the book by someone that you will all be many aware of, Dr. Simon Duffy, who is a philosopher and social innovator who works to create a world where everyone matters. Simon is president of Citizen Network Co-op and also director of Citizen Network Research, formerly the Centre of Welfare Reform. His work focuses on the ideal of citizenship and how each of us can be more fully equal and unique. So Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Johnny. That was a very nice introduction. A bit grand, isn't it? So those all too many titles. Anyway, hopefully I can get rid of a few as age approaches me. Anyway, I'm delighted to do this workshop with Eri. I've known Eri, well, I'm kind of trying to think, but too many years. So I'm kind of thinking it's like 10 years ago, Eri, when austerity had been unleashed. The Centre for Welfare Reform, as it was battling, I was going to say manfully, I don't know what the actual right adjective should be, but pointlessly against austerity and the evils of welfare reform. And out of the blue, we connected because you were doing excellent research on just some of the injustices that we were seeing unleashed at the time. I think you were Aberystwyth then, and I might have that wrong. And then you kind of, we were in touch because you were starting to explore doing a PhD on well-being in kind of health science kind of place in Liverpool. And And then I've just kind of watched on social media as your transformation, like a beautiful butterfly into a fully fledged philosopher, engaging with all sorts of people in really interesting ways. And then your amazing PhD, which is converted into the book, which is Human Flourishing, a Conceptual Analysis. I've got that right, haven't I? Which we've talked about it, and I've just completed reading it, so it's very fresh in my mind. I thoroughly recommend it to all the audience. And so I don't know, I thought, well, like, before we get into the content of the book, Eri, I just think maybe your journey would be interesting. Can you help flesh out like a bit about who you are, how you've got onto this path?
Yeah, thanks so much, Simon and Johnny, as well for the introductions. Firstly, it's just worth saying, for the for everyone else who's here with us, sharing the moment. I think it's been 11 years, Simon, that we've known each other, and at that time, I was not a researcher at all. I was doing advice work and casework and social policy campaigning, which is sort of grey literature research, if you like. So non-academic, I would say, non-academic research. But you took me under your wing. You remember I was very young in my process, and I just was interested in what you were doing and the incredible work that you were doing at the Centre for Welfare Reform there. And you were like, yes, we'd love you to join us. And I just felt like, wow, this is incredible. I felt incredible honor to be part of what you're doing there. So thank you firstly just for being a good mentor and a friend over this decade. You've been incredible, and I really do value you and appreciate you. And obviously, I've also watched how you've exploded with your with your activism, and how Citizen Network has exploded as well, across the world. So it's an incredible blessing for everyone. So yeah, my sorry, the printer's just going off there. Sorry if there's a bit of noise in the background. So my entry into this was that at that point, really, when we were looking at some of the injustices around social welfare reforms. I was working with some of the most vulnerable people in the community, so people that suffered from mental health issues, substance misuse, alcohol misuse, you name it, learning disabilities. Many of those are reliant on social welfare. And as we both know, the age of austerity was ushered in by the coalition government, and they actually by the Tories just before, wasn't it? And probably begun actually by Labour, to be honest, begun, wasn't it, with the Labour even. So very, very problematic times for some of the most vulnerable people in our societies. And that period really saw a unique kind of era where we had immense pressure on public services, immense pressure on the charitable sector, so third sector, and at the same time, a massive withdrawal of funding. So we just saw an explosion of mental ill health, suicide. It was very tragic to see. And so I was on the front line during that period, supporting people with advice and advocacy, and then using my casework to strategically lobby for change. And one of the key things I was involved in was the whole mandatory reconsideration problem around that. Now we won't go into that now; it's a bit technical, but yeah. So essentially problematizing the appeals process. So that was really, if you like, my entry into really caring about the well-being and how policy can harm. That was really what I was interested in, was interested in the harms of policy, and how to mitigate it best. So when eventually I got sick of campaigning and being an activist, and I just thought, there's got to be another way. I felt like there was something deeper that needed to be looked at, rather than just fighting constantly the injustices that we see. So when an opportunity came up in Edge Hill University, just outside Liverpool, to do a GTA-ship, which is a fully funded PhD, I applied and I asked for your support and advice at the time. You remember well, and I was very lucky to have been given the opportunity to study with them. So they effectively had a research proposal prepared initially to look at flourishing in the context of public health. And so initially my work was going to be around the impact of public health policies and how they can contribute towards the human flourishing, how we can operationalize. That was it. So it was an empirical piece of work essentially. But really what I saw going into it was a huge problem with in the literature, lots of issues in the literature in terms of conceptual confusion and reductionism, etc. So this kind of led me down another rabbit hole where I thought, well, actually, there's something deeper that needs to happen here. So maybe I need to look at some philosophical aspects here of the work. So that's what I did. So that's really my background into it, was really thinking about, well, how, how can I try to articulate the concerns I have, the ethical concerns I have with public policy? How on earth do I navigate that? So it was very much about me growing into understanding really how on earth we can understand what's happening to us by policymakers. Because if we don't have a language around understanding it, then I think we're very susceptible to just be victimized by those that are in positions of authority and power. So it was about developing a language of understanding around what's happening, so that I could articulate it in my own mind, and then so that I can obviously help to navigate the issues in the literature, if that made sense.
But that's so important, isn't it, Eri? Because I mean, as I've I suppose I've gone on the opposite direction, which is like I studied philosophy, and you like a classic example would be in philosophy, you study in moral theory, utilitarianism, which kind of overlaps, I think, with some of the concerns you have, and you sit there as a student of philosophy, or and also my PhD, and you go, well, crudely, this is a bit crude as a philosopher, it's a pretty crap theory, isn't it? And then you wander into social sciences and you go, oh, but they all think it's true. And so you're in this kind of weird situation where you think, yeah, what from a philosophical point of view looks at the best a contested theory has become actually just accepted, because, well, on the face of it, often it just seems to be a bunch of background assumptions, including, well, it's easy to quantify stuff we make up, so let's just do that. I don't know.
It's the easiest
that's my
thing to do.
rather perception.
Yeah. I mean, the challenge really, I think, for a lot of people is that there's not really a clear path for social scientists to understand how to deal with the complexity of the issues that they're dealing with. And often what social scientists will do is just say, well, this is the best thing we've got. This is the best approach we've got, and so we may as well go with it. This is the highest, the pinnacle of human knowledge. This is as far, but and so a good example of that is the move into neurology and neuroscience, where they think actually this is the avant-garde of human flourishing, is understanding how, the different activities of the brain, etc., and how we can map it. So yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. And I think that's where we go wrong. And this is maybe it's part of a broader malaise in society where philosophy isn't taken very seriously because it's seen as a bit old-fashioned and stuffy. And it's sort of like navel gazing sort of things. So it's not seen as incredibly important. And nowadays we are caught up in a kind of managerial culture where everything has to be measured and quantified, and everything has to be justified, and it's not real unless it's scientific, basically. So that's why science has just become the dominant paradigm in it. And as I say in the book, it's a form of, really, what we're seeing is scientism, which is the over elevation of science, and extending science beyond its proper boundaries. So I think that's part of the malaise that we're in. And really the research is just caught up within that broader cultural milieu.
But before we go on to the central thesis of the book, it's worth noting that your university was incredibly helpful. I think it's quite rare to find such a support. So actually, could you just tell us a little bit about almost like how you turned your PhD round in a way, because I think that is dead interesting, and I think we should respect the Edge Hill for having given you that kind of support as well.
Yes, yes. So I mean so going into Edge Hill, as I said, it was an empirical piece of work. So that was the funding was for an empirical piece of work. So it's worth bearing in mind that any change of project or research, effectively you will have to apply for new funding. So you've lost the funding because you've got the funding for a very specific reason. So yeah, so I had a research team, supervisory team, based within the Faculty of Health and Social Care. It's now Health, Social Care and Medicine. So yeah, so I was based there. I had all the funding and everything was good there. It was all sorted. But like I said, the problems in the literature meant I felt I needed to go in a different direction, in a philosophical direction. Um, and Edge Hill were just wonderful. So effectively, what they did, and this was really and this is part of the incredible kind of serendipity of this all, because I wasn't aiming to go and to land in, for example, the field of education. I was thinking about flourishing primarily as my concern, but education happened to have a spare budget for some of their GTA ships so basically what I could do is move across from health into education under their budget, and they also had the expertise. So they had the expertise, they had philosophers there, whereas health didn't have the kind of philosophers that would have helped me with the work that I was doing. They did have one, but it was not quite in the same direction. So anyway, so it was just incredible. It was a lot of work, and actually it probably wasted about a year, the whole process of moving across. So that delayed me about a year in terms of, because I had to restart the whole project again effectively. But yes, Edge Hill were just wonderful. I got a lot of support from the graduate school in particular, but the Faculty of Health was supportive, Faculty of Education was supportive. It was just brilliant, and it was an incredible feat to turn this around. And I think they must have seen the quality, the value, the potential value in this as a project, and that was why they were willing to really go out of their way to support me with it. And kudos to them for doing so. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Eri, like bearing in mind, I think we've got a very diverse audience. So I think people will come here with, maybe the words, maybe your name or seeing something of the book. But could you kind of summarize what you would say is the set? We'll dig in deeper as we go. And just a reminder to the audience, please make a note of questions. This is after we spent a bit of time just opening the box a little bit, then we'll try and pick up people's questions. If you don't, Eri will just be listening to me ask questions. But Eri, kind of try and summarize the central thrust of the argument for us, if you can.
Yeah. Okay. So the first element of the book is a critical element, which is critiquing literature, current literature on flourishing. So it's really interested in, I suppose, providing a rationale for the project, for the for the book itself. So why does it exist? Where's its place within the literature? What contribution is it making? All of that sort. So that's a critical element, and that's effectively pulling apart a lot of the issues in the literature that I signposted to you earlier. So issues with scientism, issues with reductionism, so that would be biological reductionism, so reducing flourishing happiness to neurons firing in the brain, things like that. Or it might be a form of linguistic reductionism, which is, for example, flourishing isn't flourishing, flourishing is well-being, or flourishing is happiness, or so reducing it to a simple, simpler concept, because flourishing is complicated, so it often gets reduced to something simpler, which is easier to manage and less unwieldy. So the first element of the book really is carving out the problems in the literature, the issues with scientism, reductionism, essentialism, etc., subjectivism as well. Sorry for all these isms, but basically it's just looking at, what are the knowledge problems, I suppose, in the field? What are the problems with knowledge in the field on flourishing? What's my approach to better understanding the concept of flourishing? So that's really the first part. Then the second part, I suppose, of the book is a more positive account, and it helps to carve out or helps to articulate a particular way of understanding flourishing once we've understood the kind of how language works. So I've laid the foundation in terms of, well, look, these are the insights from Wittgenstein, Hacker, Travis, and others in terms of how language works. Well, then what are the implications then if this is how language works, which I think it does, then in that case, self-evidently does, then if this is the way that language works, then what are the implications for our understanding of flourishing in the positive sense? And so there I articulate some central concepts that are really important to flourishing. I talk about the importance of the concept of agency, so freedom, the freedom to act, the freedom to make decisions, the freedom to be an actor in your own life, basically a participant and a driver of your own life. So that I suggest is probably the most essential element of flourishing. But also other concepts. So I talk about personal development as well, personal growth, personal development. Not in the traditional sense that we might hear these concepts, which it might be in a kind of human capital sense or very neoliberal sense, where you're constantly educating yourself in order to develop your career. I don't mean like that. When in personal development, I mean it much more in terms of self-knowledge, in terms of growing through understanding yourself, and understanding your role in life. So developing a place, for yourself within life. So that takes development of a self-concept. So we all have a self-concept, and we all articulate ourselves within our own minds. We have a vision or an image of ourselves, and that plays out a kind of narrative story in our lives. And so I talk about self-development, personal development, self-knowledge, those sorts of things. I build on the work of Kasim Kassam as well, who's one of the greatest philosophers alive, and he's brilliant. And yeah, so that's another sort of very interesting area that I talk about, and I talk about knowing how as well, which is basically knowing how to. This is one of Ryle's key concepts, a philosopher from the 50s or 40s, 50s. He talks about knowing how, which is effectively a form of competence, so conceptual competence. So that's what I talk about. It's a skill and a sort of mastery over concepts that helps to develop self-mastery through self-knowledge gaining. Yeah. So agency, personal growth and development, they're two of the foundational concepts. And the other one I would suggest is meaningful happiness. So not just happiness, which is traditionally articulated, in terms of well-being or life satisfaction or hedonic happiness, etc. But I suppose it's closer to the eudaimonic conception of happiness, which is more about meaning in life, developing meaning in life. But the way that I articulate it is very much about moral orienteering. So it's about developing a kind of sense of the moral landscape, the moral dilemmas, and how to navigate those and develop satisfaction as you do so. So you get a sort of satisfaction from engaging with life in a moral sense, in a meaningful way. And this, I suggest, is one of the key elements of flourishing, is this moral dimension. Without a moral dimension, there is no flourishing. So it's not enough to simply be happy in life, to be successful, to have a great career, to have money, all of those sorts of things which we might associate with flourishing. That isn't enough in its own right or alone. What we need is a kind of moral navigation. We need the ability to navigate moral issues. So if you like, the personal development bit is kind of epistemological in the sense that it focuses on knowledge. Well, the next bit here, focus on meaningful happiness, focuses on ethical issues, ethical dilemmas, and navigating even the spiritual realm. But I suppose fundamentally, I'm interested in meeting the demands of what it means to be a human being in terms of our responsibility to each other and to ourselves. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose that there's loads of interesting things in the book, but I suppose perhaps because maybe this is an area where we've got shared human experience. What I did appreciate much greater sensitivity to the complexity of human life, to the fact that human beings themselves are very diverse, that the contexts in which they live are very diverse. And, you know, so, I mean, I find a lot of the time what we're battling is within this kind of, neoliberalism, scientism, relativism, but also kind of meritocracy is also weirdly part of this, some kind of artificial scale of values. And what I think I see in the work you're doing is much greater sensitivity to, the plurality of meaning, for instance. I mean, in working with people with complex disabilities, what you can see is people have the capacity for meaningful lives in their condition. That doesn't mean that every life is meaningful, because we also have ways of eroding that. But that's true for everybody. So it's that I thought that was, came through very strongly, that you're sensitive to the human condition, from my point of view, at least, that you weren't imposing a kind of artificially narrow scale of values onto life, and that, but that you were also, the way you made your case, which is very important, is you didn't start with our metaphysics or even our moral theory. You were just saying, well, just pay attention to how we use these words, because it's already kind of in there, isn't it? So I thought that was very important and very good, and very speaks in a way to the communities that perhaps you want to listen. Like if people are in the research community about well-being, in a way, they're probably not going to listen to a metaphysical theory, whether it's true, false, or whether such things don't make sense. That's not helpful. But if you're saying, but look, this is what the word does, I think that's very important.
Yeah, and it's, to a large extent, it's what we want to do with the word. It's kind of like to do with it's how it's the role that the word has in the language, for good reasons, because this is part of the reason you drive, your point actually drives at the heart of why it's nonsense to technicalize a concept, because words are in a web of meaning. They have relation. They're, a word is a signifier of a concept, and has very complex relations, conceptual relations, with all sorts of other concepts, related concepts. You can't just take it out like as if it's a Lego block and plop it there and then go, right, that's what it is. It's, no, its meaning is the web. Its meaning is that it is enmeshed within this web of meaning. And so this is partially why, in some regards, the whole enterprise of academia is problematic, because the way we make lots of assumptions and we build careers around what we think we know, and people listen to us as academics and scientists and philosophers and everything. But knowledge is really problematic. It's really complex. It's complex just talking about a concept, let alone a human being. If you want to think about, well, who is Simon, for example, nobody can reduce, well, this is what Simon is, this is who you are. You're incredibly complex. You've got incredibly complex web of relationships with different people, depending on which situation you're in. You've got internal conflicts where you might have, conflicting values or whatever. We're very, very complicated, and that's just even on the surface level. So knowledge is really problematic anyway. So I think part of what I'm saying in the book is that, look, knowledge is problematic. We need to have more of a humble attitude to knowledge in that regard. But if we're going to start making claims about flourishing, then we better get our sense right around what we mean. We better get our concepts in order, and be honest about the limitations of the research, or be honest about the complexities, be honest about the intricacies. Because, as I highlight in the book, there are knock-on policy, ethical impacts on real human lives. So it really matters. It's not just an academic debate or an academic argument. There are real people at the end that are being disserviced by, the way that we technicalize concepts or carve them up.
Yes, and I suppose we've got to be sensitive to the fact that the narratives that are generated, and if it's a kind of reductive narrative around any specialty, it's also a power play, isn't it, in a sense? there's always implicit in it, well, we know how to make you flourish, be happy, have well-being. We've got the technology, we've got the research, I'm the specialist. I mean, and there's not necessarily bad intent, but it's not egalitarian in its logic, is it? And it strikes me that, I mean, and I know you talk about Aristotle and eudaimonia in the book, and both positively but critically, because you can say things about Athens. But I mean, I think that there's no doubt that the kind of much more rounded sense of human flourishing that somebody like Aristotle was trying to articulate is also influenced by a kind of much greater awareness of the values of citizenship, of equality, of, maybe constrained by the Athenian imagination, or the Greek male imagination at that period. But there was, I think, a greater sense of like human value in its complexity than then you see in the modern versions of well-being.
Sure.
I think. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think my criticisms of Aristotle are quite minimal. He's just a product of his generation, his era. I mean, you can't criticize someone necessarily for that, but I mean, no, I mean, I think he's, obviously one of the greatest thinkers of all time. And I think, yes, I mean, we need more Aristotles. Simple as that. We need more. We need more great thinkers. And he is a great thinker, and he, was, he also did do conceptual analysis, so that methodologically, he practiced this, and used it to articulate his arguments, used the method. So no, I mean, he's brilliant, and I do think he offers a much richer account than what's offered nowadays. Even from the neo-Aristotelians like Christian Christiansen and others, they will theorize. They'll come up with more theoretical approaches, which are sort of social science and meets virtue theory. And again, they just fall foul of the same sorts of problems that social scientists fall foul of, which is this technicalization of concepts, and the reduction of concepts, and the reduction, therefore, of all the complexity that gives meaning to the concept itself. So yes, more Aristotle is not going to be a bad thing.
And I mean, Robert's asked a question here, which is about, can Trump be said to be flourishing? I.e., can somebody who is a psychopath or a narcissist or evil or whatever labels you want to stick on him? It reminds me also, I thought was a very good, it comes up at the end of the book. It's you take this blob argument and then you distinguish the good or I wonder whether that might, for the audience, might be quite useful just to play out that, because this is, I think I took this as one of the ways you kind of grounded the, what to me seems very truthful, which is the moral dimension of flourishing. So could you play out that argument for the audience a little bit, because I think it is a good way into one of the key issues in the book.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the blob example is problematic one, and I've always felt slightly queasy about it, but I will give you that. I will do that in a moment. Firstly, I think probably the most relevant example is an example I give earlier in I think the previous chapter on the sketch of flourishing, on that chapter. Hi, Robert, by the way. Yeah. So I in the sketch of flourishing, I talk about, I give an example of an entrepreneur, a businessman, who, for example, for all intents and purposes, is flourishing. So on the surface, he looks like he's flourishing. He's successful. He's got a good family. He's got lots of social networks. He's wealthy. He's independent or whatever. All of those things that we might think, yeah, everything's going well in his life. Yeah. So this has got to be a paradigm case of someone who's flourishing, right? But then if we look deeper into his life, then we can think about, well, what's going on really? Well, if we just imagine, so there's a thought experiment. Well, if the source of his, for example, his happiness, his wealth, and everything is that he runs a business in South America using, sort of child slavery or whatever, through immoral means, basically, then is this person flourishing? And I suggest, well, I don't think they are. You can't flourish if you're deliberately, at least, acting in an immoral way. And that's because one of the essential components of flourishing is goodness. So you need to, it's not just, for example, growth. If we had an amoral, if flourishing was just about growing your capacities or growing your wealth or whatever, if that's all it was about, then yeah, we talk about flourishing in that sense, in the sense of flourishing like Ebola flourished, you know what I mean? Or, or some disease flourished, or some scourge of Nazism flourished, or whatever. So yes, in a non-human sense, we can talk about it in an amoral sense. But when we're talking about, or when we're talking about careers, for example, like, oh yeah, their career flourished. Well, there's not necessarily a moral component in that. But when we're talking about them as a person, as a human being, there's always a moral component. So we can say, yes, he was a flourishing businessman, and that would be true. But was he flourishing as a person or as a human being? I don't think so, because he was making deliberate immoral decisions. And that's because what counts, what it means to flourish as a human being it is good growth, basically. It is not just growth, but it's good growth. Um, so so yeah, and what counts as good for a human is obviously complicated, but I think in general we can say it's moral and ethical. The other example then, in terms of the blob, I mean, it's quite an amusing example that I take from the philosopher Susan Wolf. So she talks about the blob, and she effectively criticizes or problematizes the notion of the blob, who's this kind of like lazy person, just watches TV, sits on the sofa, doesn't do much with their life. And then basically asks, well, can we judge this person as having a meaningless life? Is it a meaningful life? Is it meaningless? Those sorts of things. So I sort of advance her thought experiment, and I say, well, suggest, well, there's good blob and bad blob. Bad blob might be, yes, where someone basically is deliberately lazing around, doing nothing with their life, so they have kind of self-awareness about what they're doing, so they have responsibility. If they have a disability, for example, or they have a serious cognitive impairment, or if they have had an incredible amount of abuse in their life, so they're in mental health and recovery, etc., you can't blame, that's not the same sort of standard that you can have, for the. But if all things being equal, if someone deliberately chooses not to enact their powers as a human being, not to act morally, not to, in a way, not to flourish, chooses not to flourish, yeah, then then they do have a bit of a meaningless life, yeah. Whereas with someone who has those kinds of impairments or disabilities, or a serious mental health condition, then I think they are justifiable in their withdrawal from life, because life has been very painful for them, or they're just simply not aware. So you have good blob and bad blob. So one's justifiable, one isn't. So that's my basically case there. But that's all around the discussion around meaning in life, which is one of the essential components of flourishing, I suggest. But I think probably in terms of the Trump question, the major one is going to be this kind of businessman. Now, I make no judgments of Trump. I know that he's a problematic person, shall we say? Yeah, problematic character, right? But I don't really know what's going on in his life. I mean, I've heard a lot, I've seen a lot in the media. Do you know what I mean? I know something, but I don't really know a lot about deeply what's going on in his life. But if what's going on in his life is immoral, then basically I would suggest he's not flourishing, no chance. Yeah, even though he's wealthy, he's gone for presidency and all the rest of it. Yeah, no. But if he's deluded, I mean, that's a good question. What if he's just deluded? And that's with someone like Trump, it's highly possible they might be just severely deluded, because they've been so spoilt in their life, for example. That doesn't mean he's had an easy life, because having lots of money, and having the kind of he's had lots of challenges, I'm sure, in his life. But maybe he's, I mean, I've got, some, family, for example, that have, lots of money and everything. Well, I know what it's like. It can be extremely deluding having lots of money. That's okay. You're very limited in your experience of life when you have lots of money. You have a very narrow perspective, and you really don't know what life is actually for the vast majority of people. So, does that give him any credit? Does that, you know, help him along a little bit? Maybe, maybe. It depends on the sin, you know, depends on what we're talking about. What's the crime we're talking about, you know? So, but yeah, I wouldn't suggest that Trump is excluded from flourishing just because he's Trump. He's the Trump that we know in the media. But, you know, on deeper, you know, investigation, if we found something, you know, a deep moral flaw, then I would suggest, and he deliberately engages in it, then yes, I would say that is a problem with flourishing, if that made sense.
And in a way, I know it's a kind of extreme case for judgment, but the Greek idea that you can only judge somebody once they're dead, that you can only decide whether somebody's, and it sounds very paradoxical in English, but
Yeah,
that somebody is flourishing or has flourished when they're dead.
yeah,
And then, you know, Aristotle gives some quite amusing examples of people who could be said to be flourished because they died in the prime of youth, because we know everything about what happened and they kind of died at a moment of glory. So that's flourishing. And that seems very ironic to us because we live in an era where we kind of very frightened of talking about death and thinking about death and thinking
right.
about that life in that way. So
Yeah,
yes, I mean, it's a good point, isn't it? In a sense, what will history make of Trump is, even
right.
for those of us who are highly suspicious, still going to be a bit of a mystery. We don't there's lots of things we simply don't know about
I mean,
what
yeah,
what how history will judge such a man.
yeah. I mean, he comes across to me as somewhat self-deluded and inept. I mean, you know, so if you're I don't mean to be mean. You know, I'm just, you know, just this is just the media Trump that we see. You know, I mean, you know, if that's the case, then he's probably got some credit. You know, there's probably some saving graces there somewhere. You know, so, you know, but who would know? But in terms of Aristotle's sort of, in terms of Aristotle's kind of, you can only really understand flourishing by looking back on someone's life. I mean, you know, that is when we, in English, where we might say they had a flourishing life. Yeah, you know, that's the sort of use that we would have in that sense in English. Well, they had a flourishing life. Um, but that doesn't limit how we use flourishing in English. We use flourishing, like, for example, how's your child doing? Oh, they're flourishing. Yeah, you know, or how's your husband, your wife doing, or how are they doing, you know, after an operation? Oh yeah, they're flourishing, or whatever it might be. Or oh, how's Johnny doing? Yeah, well, their career, you know, they're taking off and they're happy and everything's going well and they're brilliant, or whatever. Yeah, so we have perfectly ordinary uses of flourishing, as well as the use that Aristotle talks about, which is, oh, they had a flourishing life. But I wouldn't suggest that, you know, the English concept of flourishing is the same in that sense as the eudaimonic concept, where you can only judge it according to Aristotle anyway, you know, that by looking back. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I always think, again, there's a bit in Aristotle where he talks about your child, but I think that's a very good way of actually understanding what we might mean. When you say your child is flourishing, you certainly do hope for skill development and all sorts of things, but a lot of it is moral development, isn't it? I mean, if the idea that your child is learning skills to harm other people, you would kind of exclude the category of flourishing. Oh yeah, they've worked out how to really hurt their sister. You know, that
Yeah.
they've learned some skills to delude people, or, you know, like it's a moral evaluation that we're making, and
Goodness.
because we care so passionately about the child,
Yeah.
that's almost like front and center, I think, of our evaluation. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so let me turn the question to back to like the policy questions, the partially which drove you into this.
Yeah.
If you were to characterize what are some of the biggest risks from, if you like, the well-being, flourishing industry or government grasping these concepts, what are some of the biggest risks we face if people don't take some of your concerns seriously, do you think?
I mean, I think it's probably one of the biggest questions of our time. So I do think it's not because it's mine and I've raised it and I'm so great. You know, I don't mean it in that sense. I just think that it's one of the biggest undealt with issues. We don't talk. I think we've been pacified as populations, as civilians. I think we've been dumbed down, to be honest. And we've become very passive. We've forgotten our need to engage in our duties as citizens. Um, our duties to really critique what's coming from politicians in particular, but also researchers and others. I suppose for those that are capable, to critique. But fundamentally, in the realm of policy, I mean, we should have a much more aggressive approach to dealing with politics. We're very, very passive. And I think part of that is this neoliberal malaise that we're in, where we're all just happy to be entertained and to buy things. And I think the thing is, and this is part of a kind of almost like a bait and switch technique that's happened over generations, I think, of politicians, is that we may have been in a better generation before, say 60s, 70s, where we had better quality politicians, even 80s, 90s, I don't know, Tony Benn, probably one of the last great politicians, I would say. Yeah. So, we've had a good balance, I think, of politicians of the kind of psychopathic, inept politicians, but also the morally grounded, ethical, brave, kind of soldiers that are willing to stand up, for the people, etc. We've had a relatively good balance, I think, over recent decades, until recently, until maybe the post the 2000s. They all seem to be churned out from the same factory, yeah, since the war on terror, really, probably since then. So they're all coming out of the same sort of politician factory, Oxbridge, whatever, they all do the same, PPPE, they all have the same training, they all same prep. But it's not just a UK thing, it's a global phenomenon. So I can only imagine that behind the scenes, what we've had are organizations like the WEF and other lobbying institutions that have had a huge influence on training politicians to harmonize their thinking across the globe. And we never saw this more loud and clear than during the pandemic. It was a chorus across the world. And so I think in the background, what we have are very influential lobbying institutions that coupled with a shift in culture, which is kind of consumerist, and apathetic. And that's why we've landed where we're at. And then also you have this sort of, in terms of academia, you have this relativism, postmodernism, and so on. We have a kind of perfect storm of issues that have, I think, eaten away at our sense of citizenship. So, whether or not you should take this stuff seriously, I mean, I think for me, it's an existential crisis that we're in. But I don't want to be one of the, I'm not trying to harp on to worry people. I think that we need to focus on what we want in life rather than what we don't want. So I think that we are in an existential crisis, civilizational crisis, I think, across the West, because of these problems. But they're easily remedied just by citizens, becoming more involved and caring more and becoming more informed and doing stuff in their community, all those sorts of ordinary things that maybe a couple of generations ago people took for granted. We just need to rediscover some of that stuff.
How does I don't think it's, I mean, I can kind of make some assumptions, but maybe you could help me be clearer. How does the kind of almost industrial well-being and the simplification or shallow nature of that, I've got a technology, I've got a theory, and then it's going to deliver well-being. How does that, which I think is kind of the thing you're critiquing at the beginning of the book,
yeah,
how does that feed into the crisis of our times, Eri? Can you make that a little bit more explicit? Why are those two things related? We could be having the crisis of our times for other reasons, couldn't we? Or do you think this is an essential ingredient or dimension of it in some way?
I mean, I think it's more the issues in the well-being industry, as Davies calls it. The issues in the well-being industry are ubiquitous. I don't think they've driven any of these issues, though. So that's important to note. I don't think that all the issues in the well-being industry have driven any of this. I think they're a product of it. But what they do is they reinforce. So they help to refeed the beast, so to speak. So we have ridiculous things that happen, for example, in in schools where teachers are having a mental health breakdown because they're overworked, and the school manager sends them on a resilience course. Yeah, instead of changing their work conditions or instead of like reducing their workload, or instead of having a healthier work culture, they'll just send them on a resilience course, something like. So that's an example of where this well-being industry has gone toxic. There are recent moves to improve and have a deeper understanding of all of these things. You know, we see that in the coaching field in some areas, but and beginning to emerge in the research field. So so I think Sarah Willen, who might be here at some point, is one of those who's doing some great work. Sort of highlighting some of those issues, related issues. So yeah, so in terms of how they're related, I would say they're not fundamentally related in terms of they're not causal. What's going on in the causal sense of those things that I was speaking about before is the kind of malaise around consumerism and all that sort of stuff, and apathy, and we've just been put to sleep a bit as a population. But then what they're doing is they are reinforcing at the managerial level, at the leadership level, all of these toxic practices that just helps to perpetuate the neoliberal beast, which is problematic.
There's a kind of yeah, it's a complicity thing. So it reminds me of, I suppose, an example that comes to mind is, I mean, for Citizen Network, we've done a lot of work with people with chronic illness. They've been subject to all sorts of assumptions made around how you get out of this state, which don't actually relate to, let's think harder about what's caused ME or what people with ME are saying is helpful. But no, we've got this CBT approach, and then there's a whole industry created, and there's a whole government policy, a logic, funding, streaming off of public resources to feed people who've already got resources, taking that money away from people living with disabilities or living with illness, but built around this kind of very simplistic narrative. Oh, you're deluded about what's really wrong with you. We know what's wrong with you. Yeah. This is the thing. There's no evidence for it. I mean, this is so bad. It's like it's not even the kind of shallowing out. It's actually just distorting evidence. But there's these kind of public policy narratives are constructed very easily, aren't they? The cure for your illness is you need a job. But when we look at the evidence, actually, bad jobs create mental illness, but we don't attend to the conditions of bad jobs or what that might be, what's actually driving some of the factors that are making work feel meaningless or painful or so so this we see this all over the shop, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the work point that you just made at the end there's a lot of work going on in an understanding around the importance of making work more worthwhile, more meaningful, having more social connections, more balanced life, and all. There's a lot of work going on in that area. Bullshit jobs, yeah. There's a lot of work there is a lot of bullshit jobs around. Yeah, there are. Yeah. But there's a lot of recognition of the importance of making work more meaningful, but it is at the high end. It's affecting the executive class more than anyone else. There's not really those people on the ground that are seeing many moves in terms of having more meaningful work. That's not, they're as they've always been subjected to the whims of the elite classes, and that is it's just it's kind of a feature of a especially capitalist society, but any kind of elite culture, class culture, based culture would have those sorts of features.
I think we've got about half an hour left, folks, and so there's quite a lot of questions already, lots of interesting ones. There's one that seems to, I might be simplifying a bit, but I think in various forms it's in there from about 3 or 4 different people, Eri. So I suppose when we've talked about, I think I apologize to anybody if this is badly, I'm just trying to squeeze some of these together, but I would say it's roughly speaking, it's this question of like, well, we've said flourishing implies a kind of moral dimension, and yet people are very aware that people have different moral perspectives, even very sharp contrasts. So there's Reinhardus makes the point about people's view of abortion, for instance, are highly contested. So I mean, what do you think about the moral relativity meets flourishing, I guess, or yeah, how do you deal with that?
I mean, I'm not a moral relativist, but we do need to be we do need to think contextually, about moral dilemmas. So that's not the same as moral relativism. There is a case for moral realism in the sense for human beings, because there are harms that are, generalizable for human beings. And generally, especially in the context of flourishing, we're talking about the harms, including things like, for example, the inhibition of the expression of your natural, capacities, your giftings and all the rest of it. So the restriction or the inhibition of those, that the ability to express yourself and be a human being, be the human being that you are clear harms that we are all susceptible to as human beings, and that's a moral wrong that happens every day, across society. So, there are moral realist points that we can make, where we talk about what it means to be human, and therefore we can understand what it can mean to wrong a human being. But there are also relative wrongs where one wrong wouldn't be wrong in another case. Do you know what I mean? So there is an element of relativism that's, you know, relative to the context, which is justifiable. But I'd have to have a case to work with in order to say, is that, like the Trump case, for example, you know what I mean? That's a good example where it's kind of slightly tricky, it's nuanced. You can say, well, I wouldn't say he's all evil, whatever, but if we had a case where he was clearly like, abusing or doing something else, then we could say yes, you know what I mean? So it just depends on what we know. Yeah.
And yeah, well, and probably I can't push you very hard because my whole PhD was a case for moral realism. So,
All right.
but I think one of the things
We agree then.
yeah, so we could open ourselves up to moral relativism, but in a sense, your argument is, which is actually, it is one of the strategies for defending moral realism, is to go to what do we mean by the words we use,
Right.
and
Yes.
actually, it's effectively very hard to operate. We sometimes pretend we can step back from moral judgments, but actually, all the people who are putting forward their well-being arguments or their social policies for X or Y. I mean, Reinhard is asking the question, but Reinhard and I are both in the basic income movement. That is a moral movement. I mean, whether it's right or wrong, it's motivated by the desire to bring about improvements in the world for moral reasons, not
Yeah.
for no
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
And so yes, I think that.
Someone.
Go on.
No,
Sorry.
sorry. I was just telling them to shut the dog up. Sorry. Sorry.
So distraction. So, but there's another interesting argument, and Nick puts this not quite as a question, but I think it is very relevant to your argument. So he talks about, how do you think a socio-political movement should engage people in the pursuit of flourishing without being overly paternalistic? How do you think people's adaptive preferences can be overcome? The happy poor thing, I suppose. So I think that this is an interesting element of, well, isn't it? I think
Yeah. Yeah.
object. I mean, I suppose I think you've touched on this, but what do you think about the dangers of general paternalism when we start
Right.
talking word flourishing?
Yeah. I mean, really, really good question. Good point. And something that actually I focus on quite a lot in the book. So thank you, Nick, for uh, asking the question. I mean, look, paternalism is actually a form of disabling. So what you do when you are acting paternalistically is you're infantilizing those that you are being paternalistic towards. So there's no real justification for that unless there's a need for it. And sometimes there's a need in the sense of children, when you're a genuine parent, and someone has lack of, children have lack capacities. I mean, and so on. And perhaps, again, with those that have some cognitive disabilities and so on, that they need a lot of steering and support. But, the baseline of, I think, a thriving society has to be that you accept that as human beings, we're all rational agents. you know, and that we're able to make decisions for ourselves unless there's a good reason to think otherwise. You know, as I said, for those other sorts of things, whether children or disabled or whatever, like as in cognitively, severely, and I mean severely, cognitively disabled, you know. So yeah, I mean, I don't like any moves that aim to push flourishing on people. um, you know, people flourish from within themselves. That's how people flourish. They don't flourish from external pressure. Um, so you can't force people to flourish. You can't shove it down their throats. You can't, you know, all of that stuff. It's just ridiculous. It's oxymoron. It's moronic to think you can do that. But it won't stop people trying to do that, because that's the culture we live in, the managerial culture we live in. So, you know, they'll be trying to force people to flourish. Oh, yeah, well, we need people to flourish. So therefore, this is what we'll do. This is the sort of action, you know, instrumental, managerial, performative, you name it, culture that we live in. So I think we have a tendency towards thinking that, and actually there is a tendency within the flourishing movement, to be honest, that, oh, we've got to figure out how to make populations flourish, for example. Yeah. You can't make populations flourish. What you can do is you can help to provide the conditions for flourishing. That's what we as policymakers, as leaders, as teachers, as parents, anyone with responsibility or capacity to provide for others, we can help to build the conditions for flourishing. It's up to the individual to flourish within that set of good conditions. Yeah. That respects the unique dignity of that human being. They can choose not to flourish. That's their choice. You know, obviously, we're not talking about, you know, oh, it's your choice to do immoral acts and hurt people. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying, in terms of the positive, you know, account of flourishing, you know, you have to allow people to find, and I think that within the right conditions, flourishing naturally emerges in people. And this is the beauty of it. You don't have to force it. You don't have to push it. You know, you just allow the space. And this is the sort of work that I try to do with the Flourish Cafe social enterprise that I do. Yeah, you can't fix people. Thank you, Brian. Yeah. You know, well, we're all broken in some way. We all got our issues, and we have to work through them, you know, in life. You know, we've got different mini traumas or major traumas, etc., that we have to work through in life. So that's why it's so specific to us. So, but you know, but I think that, you know, I think it's just misconceived, and it's deeply unethical, any paternalistic approach to flourishing. You know, we have to provide the conditions. And as I was going to say with Flourish Cafe, when I'm in this environment, when I'm working with people, what I want to do as a host, as an event host, is to provide the conditions within which they feel free to speak without fear, without hindrance. They feel accepted, they feel valued, and they can work through their own nonsense. So, you know, it's okay to work through your own nonsense in a safe environment. You know, we're not judging each other. You know, we're not like finding fault. You know, this is what part of the problem of our highly competitive capitalist culture is. It's fault finding all the time. So everyone has to be on edge, paranoid, anxious, you know, etc. So, you know, but that's a very unsafe culture to live within, you know. So we have to create spaces of safety. And so that's Flourish Cafe is one of those spaces. But a good teacher, for example, in a classroom will do that with his children, you know, that he's responsible for. He'll create a safe environment within which they can flourish, within which they can express themselves, within which they can feel like they can develop and grow. Part of that is not correcting them all the time, not telling them where they're wrong all the time. It's allowing them to learn their own way through their mistakes, but being a good guide for them in that context. And that's being a good teacher. That's the kind of thing that we need in society, I think, is to be honest, it's going back to a bit of a sort of boring old-fashioned word, but wisdom. We need more wisdom. You know, we need more wisdom. You know, it's not sexy. It is a bit old-fashioned, but hell, do we need it? You know, we really do, in buckets, politicians, but the public as well. We all need more wisdom. But that requires spaces of reflection, contemplation, practices. It requires spaces with leaders in the communities and nationally that organize those sorts of things. You know, it requires some leadership. So that's where I think there is a role that we all can play to help to provide kind of micro spaces of flourishing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to say that, I mean, I'm making your argument for you, but the centrality of freedom assumes no paternalism. Now, of course, paternalism is part of the culture we have to combat, but I think it's also important to reinforce the importance of meaning in combating paternalism, because doing something meaningful is something that can actually only be judged from the person's point of view. So there is something that, I can't tell you what's meaningful for you. I mean, that it just, again, doesn't make sense in the language. So these things act as, if one is prepared to dig into what flourishing means, they act as some kind of protection against paternalism and offers a way of framing it. You talked about Sen's work on development as freedom, didn't you? So there are people thinking about what are the conditions we create and treating freedom as an essential element. But it is running against the grain of a lot of what's going on in public policy. But then this is at least lending support to that counter movement. There's a question from Emily, which I think is kind of takes us in an interesting track as well. So Emily says, it seems in this introduction that the concept of human flourishing is useful supporting the transition to sustainable modes of living, i.e. sufficiency economy or good life approach could act as an alternative to rampant capitalism, high consumption. What's your perspective on, because I suppose this is also trying to then sketch out the space we want to move to. Do you think that this is a congruent to some different vision of human life?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if we took flourishing seriously, we wouldn't necessarily be having this sort of culture, this sort of civilization, to be honest. It's not a culture that is oriented around flourishing. It's a culture that's oriented around, I suppose, the individual and gain and those sorts of things, capitalist issues, which probably most of us know about, those sorts of problems. So I think, one of the core elements of flourishing that I try to talk about is this notion of responsibility. And, and so if we take ourselves seriously, our flourishing seriously, it isn't about us, it's about us within a system or within a network or within a community. That's what it's relational. So it's about, there is this lovely African concept, Ubuntu, which some of you might have heard of, which is, there is something like, I'm paraphrasing it probably horribly, but something like there's no flourishing with me, it needs to be flourishing with us, something like that. So that's what I think is flourishing is all about, really. It's all about figuring out systems where we can cooperate and work more effectively together. By the way, and because I don't know if it's implicit in the question from Emily, but that doesn't make me a leftist. All right. Yeah. All right. Yeah. All right. So to be honest, I've traditionally been kind of center left in terms of my politics. So that's roughly where I sit on most issues. But I'm not a heavy government person in terms of, if we want to translate that to politics, that doesn't mean that I'm in favor of heavy government policies, central planning, and those sorts of issues. I think we need to figure out more local ways of managing. And I think I'm an advocate for localism more than a kind of socialism. I think localism is probably the best answer to some of our ills that we're at right now. Maybe there are different answers during different epochs in history. You know what I mean? It's not always, oh, this is the only way. Maybe different epochs have got different answers. And I think for our particular issues that we face right now, we need regionalism and localism. I think that's what I would suggest is a good way to do it, where we have responsibility for our region and we care about the people within our region and our community, and and we have responsibility and agency within that sphere. And if we did that, that would alleviate a lot of the problems that the green movement raise in terms of excessive carbon or ecological damage and all the rest of it that is as a result of rampant capitalism. A lot of that would be dealt with if we just were more regional and more local. And that's nothing new to the green movement. Obviously, they'll know about that. They've been advocating for that for decades. But you don't need to be, what I'm saying is you don't have to be a hard leftist or something to agree with that. There are kind of capitalist forms of being that are more localized, that are more regional and that are more sustainable. That can work.
As we head towards the finish line area, I'd like to ask you about almost kind of where next a bit. You've talked about actually Flourish Cafe a little bit. I've also seen you again through social media active in different discussions about the future of education. You're still very active in philosophical circles, and presumably, I suppose perhaps my starting question is, but maybe you could just explore some of these things with me. Presumably you're being heard by people in maybe it's a rather unflattering to call it the well-being industry. That's just me, but
Yeah.
you know, there's a complicated. It's not one thing, obviously, but
No.
you know, that you critique a whole section of both social sciences, health sciences, and actually business, and the state statutory sector. So what's kind of response are you getting? What do you feel like personally is your way through some of this? What kind of things would you like some of us, allies, friends, interested people, to be thinking about as we go forward?
Yeah, I mean,
That's
I'm
a
very,
very baggy question.
yeah, I mean, I'm just aware that Sam has got a good question in the chat there, Sam
All
McDonald.
right.
We
Sorry if
might
I
come
missed
back to
that.
her in a moment. The um so the yeah, so my thoughts on what next, I suppose, or what to do. I mean, I am very, I think I'm really, really blessed. I think this is one of the great privileges of being an academic, is you get to speak at conferences, and like I'm going to Rome in August, for example. This is so cool. All expenses paid. How good is that? So yeah, so there are some amazing blessings. I get to meet a very wide range of people because my work actually relates to a number of different fields. So, education, psychology, social science, etc. I engage and I meet a lot of different thinkers and people. So that's a very rich experience for me. Which I'm very, very grateful for. Um, I mean, in terms of what's next, you know about Flourish Cafe, so I've mentioned that briefly. But did you mean research-wise? Is that what you meant in terms of my research? Where am I heading?
Well, I mean, say I know about Flourish Cafe, but I don't think necessarily the audience does, or some of
Oh,
them
okay.
won't.
Yeah.
Maybe explain what your motive was, because I think that's again quite an unusual action to be just running off the side of an academic career. Tell people why you created Flourish Cafe.
Yeah, it is an odd one. Yeah, definitely. I mean, so when we first met, Simon, back in 2013, something like that, the project that I published through your website, you remember, was the Fight Back report. Yeah. So the Fight Back report kind of catalogued the issues for Mid Wales, in terms of the pressure on public services and the third sector, etc. One of the main methods that I used to engage with the local service provider committee in mental health services was the World Cafe method. So that was I was a novice to the World Cafe method at that point. So I very much learnt from some great people around me, in terms of the method and how to do it and everything else. So that was my introduction, and I was one of the main hosts, or the main host, but supported by others. So it was a bit of a sort of crash course. But I mean, basically, I had loved the method of World Cafe, which is a means of being creative. So having a discussion like we're having today, but in small groups, on tables, with paper tablecloths, with pens, and working in rounds through questions, maybe 3 or 4. So not as many questions as you've asked me today, but maybe just 3 questions over the course of an hour and a half, or an hour and a bit. And you would work in rounds, so you'd be mixing with different people, answering different questions, and then each table would have the record of its previous discussion on that tablecloth. So every new group of people that came to sit at that table would add, build, critique, engage with the thoughts, with the ideas that's on this tablecloth, drawing, mind mapping, visual imagery, metaphors, all that sort of stuff. So it's a very creative process, and it's called cross-fertilization, where you have these sort of different ideas meshing together. It's very non-academic, actually. in the sense that it's all about just you can just let it all out. It doesn't matter. You don't have to like unlike the PhD or unlike the book, you know, which is all about making sure we get things right, our understanding right. Flourish Cafe is an opening, really. So or World Cafe is a method. It's about an opening of heart and mind, and finding ways to articulate it on paper and in discussion with others, and connecting with others on deep and meaningful issues. So I was a fan of the method since then. I've been part now. I think Elena is here today, so I was part of a group, Leadership for Flourishing. Excuse me, Leadership for Flourishing, headed up by Katie Granville Chapman and Emmy Bidson. Lovely people, amazing people. They invited me to speak last year at a conference, and I met them, and it was great. And I met a lovely bunch of people, and I ended up being part of a subgroup that was looking at global flourishing goals. And as part of the movement towards looking at whether we can think about global flourishing goals in a meaningful way, I met someone called Ramu Damodaran, and he's a great thinker from the UN, a former activist and thinker at the UN, and an academic as well. And literally, Flourish Cafe grew out of a conversation I had with him. We spoke about, for example, Gandhi, grassroots movements, because I was thinking in my head, there's a tension between this idea of flourishing goals at the top end, being at the government level, and actually what I'm interested in is grassroots. Actually, how can we nurture communities to flourish from the ground up, not from the top down? So that's really where Flourish Cafe was born. Flourish Cafe was born really through an identification and a realization of the issues that I see in communities, the detachment that they have with the concept of flourishing, with the idea of flourishing, with empowerment in their own communities, and figuring out, well, actually, why don't I use the method of World Cafe to help communities and help or support spaces where people can think about flourishing on a more deep level. So that's really what it was. And so I was very lucky to get some seed funding, and from the Arts and Humanities and Research Council, and Bath University, and basically, yeah, that kicked off about a year and a half ago now. So yeah, so it's very exciting. I mean, I'll pop it in the chat, the organization, but I know some of you probably already know about it. But yeah, it's been a delight and a joy seeing what creating a space of where we talk about flourishing, the power that it can have on people. It can bring people to tears. It can create incredible partnerships between different people and stakeholders, in meaningful partnerships, not instrumental partnerships where you use each other, but meaningful partnerships. And it can bring money into a community. So, one of the impoverished communities I work with, for example, it's got high deprivation. They feel lost and dejected by local decision makers, policy makers, etc. On the periphery of Bath here. Thanks to one of the events I developed there in the local community, there was a funder present, and they funded a festival in the village, things like that. So there was a carnival, sorry. So there was a carnival celebrating everything that's good about that community the following September. This is the sort of thing that I mean. It's potentially transformative and really powerful. So I'm very excited about Flourish Cafe and where it's going. And I suppose my vision for it is to bring others in as leaders themselves, rather than it relying on me. So having a network of community leaders that can just deliver their own events. That's my vision for it.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, partly your response that relates, I think, to the force of Sam's question. I mean, I'd say, like, I don't think you're proposing like we all now learn the new science of flourishing. The thing about this is I mean, in my work with people with learning disabilities, if you start asking the right kind of questions that assume capacity, that assume meaning, energy is found. People connect, people organize. So it's not that we somehow need like some esoteric cults to pass on the new news about flourishing. It's just we actually need to start treating each other with a bit more respect,
right?
Because that's what generates people's ability to find the as it were, the keys to their own flourishing and collective flourishing. And
yeah,
I
I
agree
mean, they
also
just need
that
they need permission. So, you know, they just need, you know, sometimes we need permission to think outside the box and to connect with each other, because there are so many barriers, whether it be class barriers, you know, racial barriers, you know, whatever, prejudices or whatever, all these different things that separate and fragment everybody. We just need to get in the room. And that's the amazing thing about spaces like World Cafe, Flourish Cafe, etc., is that they're great levelers. So you have people at strategic level, as well as, you know, service users or ordinary people, whoever, you know, the dejected amongst us are sitting opposite each other on a table, you know, mano y mano, so to speak, you know, so there's human to human, you know, so there's none of this kind of pretense that you can get at traditional events and formats. You get little cliques, you know, you get the elite guys hanging out together, you know, they're meeting for lunch later, you know, they're joining, you know, or whatever, you know. So no, you don't get that. You get everybody coming together, and that's the power of it. It is beautiful. But you're right, Simon, you don't need any experts, and I don't use my expertise in Flourish Cafe per se. I inform it in terms of how it helps me to understand and interpret what's being said, but I don't go in saying, oh, this is what flourishing is now, figure it out for yourself. No.
So, Eri, we've got 5 minutes left. I think we've had some great questions. So, and we're just going to, like, if you've just got like 2 or 3 minutes to just what's any final words, final thoughts, key thing we just didn't cover. I mean, I know there's loads of things really, but is there something you just would like to say to kind of is your final contribution tonight?
I mean, I think just Sam made a really important point in her question earlier about whether you need, and if I'm understanding you right, Sam, about whether we need the concept of flourishing per se, you know, whether it needs to be articulated per se. And this has come up before in discussions, and I don't think it does. I think flourishing is actually more about the practice. It's more about a practice of flourishing kind of habits of thinking and of being. You don't need to know the concept of flourishing at all to flourish. You just need to know how to flourish. You know. So, but the word, the concept, you know, for many of us, it's an opener to a whole discussion that is probably excluded from a lot of our dialogue in our everyday lives. I don't think it's talked about a lot in the news. I don't think it's spoken about much. You know, even in academia. In academia, you've got a very siloed community that talks about flourishing. It's very closed off. You know, so, you know, generally, it's not really something that we talk about or we care about, even in politics. I think it's central, though. So I think it's a good trigger for discussion. It's a good, you know, kind of catalyst, if you like. That's a better word. It's a good catalyst for discussion about what's meaningful in life and what can help to contribute to a happy and a better life for us all. So it's useful in that sense, but we don't need the concept. You know, we don't need anyone's theory. We don't, you know, you don't need my book, by the way, either. Okay. I had to break it. You don't need my book, you know, we don't need anything. I think a lot of this is self-evident to many of us who have got sensitivity to, if we care about the sorts of things that flourishing talks about, meaningfulness, happiness, personal growth, excuse me, we'll have a good sense for actually what can pull us in the right direction just by having human judgment, good human judgment. As long as we've got a good environment, some good mentors in our life, etc., those sorts of things. As long as we have a good pull, a good orientation. Sometimes, and this is where we do need the concept or the word, is where we've been misled, where we're deceived, where we are deluded, or where we are confused. This is where we need explicit, and that's where the book is useful. You know, that's where a book like mine is going to be really useful when we're thinking about how to deal with these problems, dilemmas, and issues in the field or in the concept. So yeah. So I think basically, you know, you can throw it all out the window if you have a good orientation in life. But if you don't have a good orientation, you need a little bit of help. This could help you. This book or talking about flourishing could help. Does that make sense? Is that all right?
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a really good. No, that's a really good note to end on. So first of all, Eri, I'll take my courage in my hands and say, well, I think you're flourishing. And I think probably two of the things that have helped you to flourish and I think make a contribution is courage and integrity. I mean, I can't imagine quite all the things you've had to go through to just go on this journey, but I think it's required probably at least a couple of those things. So thank you for your courage, thank you for your integrity, and thank you for your wisdom, because I do think this is a very helpful reframing, and we'll debate Wittgenstein in detail over a pint.
Over a pint.
Yeah, but not everybody else can be thankful we haven't had to do that. I want to thank Opus for organising the festival debate and inviting you and I to explore this subject. And I want to thank our audience. So many of you turned up for what might have seemed a little bit abstract, but I hope that it's been useful. I've seen some nice comments in the chat, so thank you. Just last thing, Eri and I are both members of Citizen Network. If you want to join a global community that believes everyone matters, everyone can flourish, although that isn't in our mission statement. It just says everyone matters, and we then figure out the rest afterwards. So please do. It's free to join, and there are thousands of members around the world who believe every single human being is important, and the world and nature are important, and we've got to work together to try and take care of each other and all those small little places where we actually live and hopefully flourish on a good day.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back and join my Spanish friends downstairs who are in Edinburgh, learning about what we've done to achieve inclusion. And I will look forward to seeing you, Eri, in Sheffield tomorrow night.
Tomorrow.
And everyone else, enjoy your evenings. And yeah, what's the word? Robert will say it. What's the cheers word in Scottish?
Oh, I don't know. Is there a Scottish?
Slonges, something like that. I'll get it right.
Robert can
In
tell
Finnish,
us.
it's kippy. Yeah.
You're
But
on
if we
mute.
can't,
You can't tell us. All right,
please
you're on
sing
muted.
So,
okay.
bye all. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Simon. Bless you. And thank you, Johnny. Bye now.